The Veillare Foundation Gala in Denver was designed to be a masterpiece of untouchable perfection. The ballroom glowed beneath cascading crystal chandeliers, casting warm reflections across polished marble floors that mirrored the self-satisfied smiles of the city's elite. Hundreds of champagne glasses chimed softly in rhythm with a string quartet playing classical waltzes, while white roses adorned every table, filling the air with a rich, expensive fragrance. To anyone standing outside those grand double doors, it was a sanctuary of wealth, power, and philanthropy, a place where the troubles of the outside world were entirely locked out by thick mahogany and high-end security. Yet beneath that glittering facade, a quiet, fragile humanity existed. In the far corner, near the children's seating area, a sudden sharp gasp cut through the polite murmurs of the room. Even the string quartet seemed to miss a beat as the sound echoed. A little girl in a pale blue dress clutched the front of her collar, her fingers trembling as she fought for air. Her eyes widened in absolute terror, her chest heaving in short, broken spasms. An asthma attack had struck, and as adults around her froze in sudden confusion and discomfort, unsure how to handle an emergency that did not fit into their schedule, the child stood entirely alone in her panic. A few yards away stood Graham Whitaker. He was a man who belonged to the shadows of the room, invisible to the high society guests. Clad in a faded navy work shirt, worn trousers, and scuffed brown boots bought years ago at a discount store, Graham was the venue's maintenance man. He was a single father who had willingly picked up an extra shift tonight only because rent was due on Monday, and his daughter Nora desperately needed a new pair of winter boots before the first heavy mountain snow hit Denver. When that familiar, terrifying sound of a struggling breath reached his ears, every protective instinct he possessed flared to life. He did not hesitate. Dropping his heavy metal tool bag onto the marble floor with a dull clatter, Graham crossed the sprawling ballroom in long, determined strides. He dropped to his knees right beside Nora before anyone else even realized her name. "Look at me, sweetheart," Graham murmured, his voice steady, soft, and anchoring. "In through your nose, slow, just like smelling pancakes." Nora trembled violently, tears spilling from her eyes under the harsh gold lights. "Daddy, I can't." "Yes, you can. I've got you." "It hurts," she whimpered. "I know it does." Graham placed one large, calloused hand firmly behind her back to support her posture, while pointing his other hand toward a sealed, decorative side vent near the wall. "That vent is stuck. Somebody open it right now. She needs air, not attention." A nearby security guard instantly grabbed Graham by the shoulder, his face hardening with class-based prejudice. He saw only a low-wage worker stepping wildly out of line in a room full of billionaires. "Step back, mister. You don't give orders here." Graham did not pull away. He did not raise his voice or let anger distort his features. He simply looked up at the guard with a calm, unshakable gaze that carried more weight than any threat. "My daughter has asthma," he said quietly. "Move, please." Before the guard could react, a subtle parting of the crowd announced the arrival of Charlotte Vale. Dressed in a breathtaking white evening dress that brushed the marble floor, with diamonds catching the light at her ears, Charlotte possessed a face that dominated morning newspapers and charity magazines. As the chief executive officer of the foundation, she had personally promised $3 million for children's medical clinics across the Mountain West. But in this exact fraction of a second, she looked nothing like a corporate headline. Her expression was stripped of its rehearsed public armor. Her eyes were wide with genuine alarm and a deep, aching empathy. She looked like a human being watching the world decide whether a single child's life mattered. "Open that vent," Charlotte commanded. Her voice was low, but it carried absolute authority. Not a single person in the room dared to question her. The security guard instantly dropped his hand and stepped back as if the ground beneath him had suddenly shifted ownership. A prominent doctor from the donor table rushed over, dropping to his knees beside Graham and Nora. He saw Graham holding the trembling child, saw Charlotte kneeling right beside them on the expensive fabric of her gown, and noticed the way Nora's small fingers had automatically curled around Charlotte's wrist, as if she belonged there. The doctor looked up at Charlotte, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Is this your husband, Miss Vale?" Graham immediately lifted his head, opening his mouth to set the record straight. "No, sir, I am," just before the words could leave his lips. Charlotte caught sight of Nora's face tightening with preemptive humiliation. She saw the heavy wave of shame rising in the little girl long before her breath had even fully returned the cruel burden a child feels when she realizes she is causing a scene in front of wealthy strangers. Without missing a beat, Charlotte gently covered Nora's small hand with her own and looked the doctor dead in the eye. "He is with me." 3 simple words. Soft, clear, and utterly impossible to take back. The atmosphere in the entire ballroom shifted instantly. The security guard lowered his radio. The doctor immediately deferred to Graham's medical instructions, asking about her triggers and inhaler location without a trace of condescension. The wealthy donor standing nearby stopped whispering long enough to watch the little girl's breathing stabilize. Graham, however, sat frozen for a brief second. He stared at Charlotte with a mix of shock and profound gratitude. The most powerful woman in the room had just thrown her own pristine reputation over him like a shield, protecting him from public humiliation and shielding his daughter from the sting of shame. She had quietly stepped into a profound misunderstanding that would irrevocably alter all 3 of their lives. As Nora's breathing finally evened out under the cool stream of air flowing from the newly opened vent, the ballroom slowly attempted to return to its previous rhythm. A woman in heavy pearls slowly lowered her smartphone, a look of lingering guilt crossing her face as she realized she had nearly recorded a child's medical terror as social media entertainment. The string quartet in the corner resumed playing, though the notes still trembled softly through the air like light filtering through rain. When Nora finally whispered, "Daddy, I'm okay now," Graham closed his eyes for half a second. It wasn't long enough to cry, just long enough to process the sudden mercy that had quietly slipped into the room without asking permission. Charlotte remained right where she was, kneeling on one knee on the marble floor. Her dress was worth more than Graham's entire pickup truck, yet she showed no concern for its fabric. She did not make the moment about her own philanthropy. She simply stayed. And in rooms built on artificiality, simply staying was the rarest form of grace. Across the sprawling hall, Preston Calder watched the scene unfold with a stiff, professional smile and eyes as cold as winter ice. Preston was the architect of Charlotte's public image. He had spent years building her reputation like a towering glass structure, elegant, distant, pristine, and entirely untouched by ordinary messiness. To Preston, public perception was everything, and vulnerability was a fatal liability. Now, in less than 5 minutes, a maintenance man with worn boots and a frightened daughter had shattered that carefully curated illusion, making Charlotte look jarringly, beautifully human. Worse still, Charlotte had allowed it, and her expression made it terrifyingly clear that she was not sorry in the least. Graham helped Nora gently to her feet once the doctor gave the all clear. He lifted her small pink backpack from beneath a velvet chair, unzipped the front pocket, and checked the label of her inhaler twice with the meticulous care of a man guarding a fragile world. "Thank you," Graham said to Charlotte, keeping a careful, respectful distance, the precise distance a working man learns to maintain in expensive rooms where he knows he doesn't belong. "You didn't have to do that." Charlotte looked away toward the rows of empty donor tables, pretending not to stare. "Yes, I did." "No, ma'am," Graham replied gently, adjusting Nora's cardigan over her shoulders. "You could have corrected him. You could have told the truth." For the first time all evening, Charlotte did not have a polished response ready. The golden chandeliers glowed softly overhead, but beneath that artificial warmth, she could feel the heavy, grinding machinery of high society judgment turning names, net worth, titles, and exclusive circles where people decided your value before you even spoke a word. She looked down at Nora, who was now clutching one of Charlotte's diamond-ringed fingers with shy, embarrassed trust. "She was scared," Charlotte said quietly. Graham followed her gaze. Nora was looking down at the floor, wishing she could vanish. "She gets embarrassed after an attack," Graham explained softly. "Thinks people will look at her and see weakness." Charlotte's face softened in a way cameras had never managed to capture. "I know what that feels like." Graham looked up, surprised not by her words, but by the raw honesty behind them. Charlotte Vale, the woman whose signature could move millions of dollars before lunch, had spoken, not like a corporate icon, but like someone sharing a deep-guarded confession. As a server passed them carrying silver trays of sparkling water, Charlotte began to speak of her past. When I was 10, my father brought me to a charity gala in Boston. I accidentally spilled soup on my dress. Nothing catastrophic, just soup. But the room went dead silent. I remember every single adult face turning toward me, staring as if I had just proven a terrible theory they already believed. Nora glanced up, her curiosity breaking through her shyness. What did they believe? A bittersweet smile touched Charlotte's lips. That children should be absolute perfection if they're ever going to be allowed near important people. Graham's jaw tightened visibly. That is a cruel thing to teach a child. It is, Charlotte whispered. Did anyone help you? She asked, looking across the room at the massive banners carrying her family name banners surrounded by trustees who smiled only when money was near and vanished the moment genuine kindness was required. No, Charlotte answered her own question, her voice dropping to a whisper. They corrected me. The silence that followed was small, heavy, and sacred. Graham did not offer cheap advice or hollow comfort. He understood that some wounds don't need fixing with words, they just need space to breathe. Nora, sensing the emotional shift, took a shy step forward and pulled a folded piece of paper from her backpack. It was covered in colorful pencil lines, a large building with oversized windows, bright yellow lights, and 3 small stick figures standing safely under a wide roof. You can hold my drawing if you want, Nora whispered. Charlotte accepted the paper with both hands, treating it with more reverence than any multi-million-dollar check written that night. Across the room, Preston Calder saw the exchange. He saw Charlotte smiling down at a maintenance man's daughter, and he knew a dangerous line had been crossed. She hadn't just protected them from shame, she had invited them directly into the human sanctuary inside her that no board member had ever been permitted to touch. Preston Calder moved across the ballroom with the practiced, effortless glide of a man who never hurried unless an audience was watching. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his smile professionally polished, and his eyes completely devoid of warmth. He stopped directly beside Charlotte, just as Nora nervously folded her hands behind her back, sensing the intrusion of another powerful adult into their safe circle. Charlotte, Preston said, his voice smooth, low, and laced with quiet steel. May I borrow you for a moment? Graham stepped back immediately. It wasn't out of cowardice, but out of the hard-learned survival instinct of working-class men who know all too well how quickly an elite class can twist kindness into an accusation of overstepping. We should go, he whispered to Nora. Charlotte turned sharply. You don't have to leave. Preston offered a quiet, calculated laugh, the kind designed to sound harmless to everyone except the person it targeted. I am sure Mr. Whitaker has duties to attend to. The West Corridor lights still need checking, do they not? Graham looked at Preston for one long, unblinking second before nodding. They do. Nora's small hand instinctively slipped back into her father's grip. Charlotte saw that retreat, and every protective instinct inside her tightened like a coiled spring. Preston leaned closer, lowering his voice so the surrounding donors would perceive only sophisticated elegance rather than heavy-handed pressure. You need to correct this narrative before it grows legs, Charlotte. Correct what? Charlotte asked, refusing to look away from Graham and Nora. The misunderstanding, Preston hissed softly, his smile thinning to a razor edge. A child had a medical scare, and you announced to an entire ballroom that her father was with you. He was with me. Don't play word games, Charlotte. You know what they heard. All around them, whispers began to weave through the crowd like venomous threads. A trustee near the silent auction table glanced pointedly down at Graham's scuffed work boots. A woman with a diamond tennis bracelet murmured something behind her jeweled hand, her eyes darting toward the father and daughter. The rumor was no longer a harmless spark. It was thick smoke finding dry curtains. Preston kept his tone level, but his words grew sharper. Your brand is built on discipline, independence, and absolute control. You are not a small-town fairy tale, Charlotte. You are the face of a national foundation. You cannot afford to look emotionally compromised by a maintenance man and his daughter. Graham had heard enough. He didn't argue or raise his voice. Instead, he simply bent down on one knee to tie Nora's loose shoelace, working with slow, deliberate care as if absolute dignity could be practiced in small, neat knots. "Daddy," Nora whispered softly, "did we do something wrong?" Graham paused for a single breath. "No, Button. Then why is that man mad?" Graham finished the bow and gently tapped the toe of her shoe. Some people just get very nervous when human kindness makes a lot more sense than money. Charlotte heard every word. She looked at Preston, really looked at him, seeing the man who had spent months shaping her speeches, choosing her gowns, and trimming away every raw, honest edge of her public life until she looked like a monument and felt like a ghost. "Not yet," Charlotte said quietly. Preston blinked, thrown off balance. "Excuse me? I said I am not correcting anything. Not yet." Preston's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "You are making a massive mistake." Charlotte's fingers closed gently around Nora's drawing. The paper was soft from being folded too many times, its yellow windows glowing bright beneath the overhead lights. "Maybe," she replied, her voice firm, "but for once it feels like my mistake." Preston stepped back, forcing the polite smile back onto his face for the benefit of the watching crowd. But his eyes had turned entirely predatory. He had come to manage a minor PR rumor. Instead, he was now staring at a full-scale threat. The danger wasn't in Graham's clothes, nor in Nora's innocence, nor even in Charlotte's quiet defiance. The true threat was that for the first time in years, Charlotte Vale had chosen raw grace over corporate image, and Preston Calder knew that if she stayed on that path, he would lose absolute control of the foundation. By the time Graham and Nora reached the outer perimeter of the ballroom, the room had mastered a new cruelty, smiling at them without an ounce of kindness. That was the strange, suffocating malice of elite spaces. No one pointed fingers, no one shouted insults. They simply created an invisible radius of empty space around the working man and his daughter, turning that isolation into a silent insult. Graham felt it in the way conversations instantly dipped as he passed, and in the way wealthy eyes automatically dropped to his utility belt and old boots. Nora felt it too, because children absorb the heavy vibrations of adult judgment long before words are spoken. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging gently on his sleeve, "are they looking at your shoes again?" Graham glanced down as if he had entirely forgotten he possessed feet. "Probably. Why?" "Because they squeak when I walk." Nora almost smiled. "They do not. They do when I dance." "You don't dance." "Not in public," Graham smiled gently. "I save my best work for kitchen floors and grocery store aisles." A genuine, musical laugh slipped past Nora's lips, carrying across the room like a match struck in a pitch-black hallway. Charlotte, standing across the hall, caught the sound and turned away from Preston, just in time to see Graham offer a ridiculous, goofy little shoulder shimmy that made Nora cover her mouth with both hands in pure delight. He wasn't trying to charm the room. He was simply fighting to give his daughter back the light that panic had stolen from her. Near the silent auction tables, a silver-haired donor named Evelyn Hartwell stepped directly into Graham's path, swirling a crystal glass of champagne. Her smile was sharp, dripping with curiosity disguised as refined manners. "Mr. Whitaker, is it?" Evelyn asked smoothly. Graham stopped, keeping Nora close. "Yes, ma'am. And what exactly do you do for Miss Vale?" The words were wrapped in silk, but the underlying question was jagged and cruel. "What are you doing here? What did you steal? Why did she defend you?" "Tonight I am checking vents, lights, and emergency exit doors," Graham answered evenly. Evelyn's smile tightened into a thin line. A younger man standing beside her chuckled softly. "Well, I suppose every Cinderella story needs someone stationed near the service entrance." The small group laughed not loudly enough to draw a formal reprimand, but just loudly enough to draw blood. Graham did not flinch. The massive chandeliers glittered overhead, and the polished marble reflected every single person in the room except for him. Yet he stood entirely straight. "Cinderella had a strict midnight deadline," he said calmly. "I just have a daughter who needs to be tucked into bed by 9:30. Nora looked up at him, deciding the joke was funny, and smiled brightly. Charlotte watched Evelyn's expression falter. She saw the young man look down into his drink as if the ice cubes had suddenly become intensely fascinating, and she saw Preston watching from the sidelines, waiting for Graham to snap, to become angry, defensive, or small. But Graham refused to hand them that victory. Before anyone else could speak, the ballroom lights flickered violently. Once, twice, a collective gasp swept through the crowd. On the massive stage, the giant digital screen behind the donation counter flashed white and then went entirely black. The room plunged into the sudden eerie silence of wealthy people, realizing that no amount of money can command electricity to behave against its will. Preston turned sharply toward the audio-visual technicians. Charlotte turned instantly toward Graham. Graham looked at the dead screen, then at the locked service panel near the west corridor. His expression shifted instantly from calm exhaustion to deep, cold realization. "Stay here with Miss Vale," Graham instructed Nora quietly. Charlotte stepped forward, her eyes urgent. "What is it?" Graham kept his voice low, his eyes fixed on the corridor. That screen shouldn't have gone dark from a simple power overload. The house lights and the main donation servers run on completely separate electrical circuits. Preston materialized beside them before Charlotte could answer, his communication headset already engaged in high-performance crisis management. This right here is precisely why my proposed emergency infrastructure contract needs to be approved tonight." He turned to the nearest board members, raising his voice so the whole room could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We anticipated the distinct possibility of an infrastructure vulnerability." Graham looked at Preston. No accusation, no awe, just absolute stillness. "You anticipated a power failure?" Preston's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We prepare for every contingency. Then your technicians should know for a fact that the backup relay isn't even housed in the main audio booth," Graham countered smoothly. Preston blinked, momentarily thrown. "Excuse me?" Graham pointed a steady finger toward the west corridor. "It's inside that locked auxiliary panel. Whoever cut that screen didn't overload the ballroom. They deliberately severed the data feed between the stage display and the primary server." The technicians near the stage stared at one another in sudden panic. One young man wearing a headset stammered, "That's impossible. That panel has been locked all evening." Graham didn't waste breath arguing. He walked straight to the decorative velvet curtain, unhooked the maintenance key from his belt, and unlocked the metal panel door. The hinges gave a dry, tired squeak. Inside, the wiring should have been clean, organized, and untouched. Instead, a single bypass switch had been yanked halfway down and tightly anchored in place with a thick strip of black electrical tape. Graham stared at it, and the room seemed to lean in toward him. "This wasn't mechanical failure," he said quietly. "This was human hands." A heavy murmur rippled through the donors. Preston stepped forward quickly, his face hardening. "That is an utterly reckless statement from a low-level worker who doesn't understand complex grid architecture." Graham turned slightly, holding up a small piece of evidence. "I understand enough not to tape down a bypass switch unless I want a complete system crash to happen right after the room fills up with people. Are you accusing someone, Mr. Whitaker?" Preston demanded, his voice dangerously sharp. "No," Graham replied, carefully peeling back the black tape by its clean edge. "I'm just saying that wires don't get embarrassed and sabotage themselves." A few nervous, forced laughs rose from the crowd and died instantly. Charlotte looked from the open panel to Preston, and for the first time Preston's corporate confidence looked less like leadership and more like a locked room hiding a dirty secret. Graham reset the switch. A second later, the massive screen flickered back to life, flashing blue before restoring the digital donation total, which remained frozen at $2.7 million. Uncertain applause broke out across the hall. But Graham didn't turn toward the stage. His eyes were locked on the inside of the panel, tracking a hidden detail near the lower bracket. Reaching deep inside, he pulled out a small adhesive access tag, the kind issued exclusively to temporary high-level contractors. Printed clearly across the plastic tag was a logo that made the blood drain from Preston Calder's face, Calder Strategic Security. The applause died out so fast it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Preston's expression fractured for a single, fleeting second before he reasserted his iron control. But Graham had seen it, and so had Charlotte. Mr. Calder, Graham said, his voice quiet enough to force everyone around him to strain their ears. Why would your private security team need unauthorized access to a master maintenance panel hours before your contract was even up for a vote? Absolute silence claimed the ballroom. Not a trustee moved. Not a donor dared to whisper. Even the reporter holding her digital recorder kept it suspended halfway to her chest, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. Beside Charlotte, little Nora clutched her colored pencil drawing like a sacred protective amulet. In that profound quiet, Charlotte finally understood the intricate, ugly architecture of the evening. The manufactured panic, the intense pressure, the prepackaged solution Preston had been waiting to sell it was all an elaborate corporate scam. And Graham Whitaker, the man the room had treated like dirt, had just exposed the rot hiding right behind the drywall. Preston Calder recovered with the practiced smoothness of a man whose entire career was built on spin. That tag proves nothing, he dismissed, brushing a hand over his tuxedo lapel. My team inspected this entire property last week at the Foundation's official request. It's a standard risk assessment tag left behind. Charlotte didn't answer him. Graham didn't answer either. He simply held the strip of black tape in one hand and the security access tag in the other two tiny, insignificant objects that suddenly carried more weight than all the multi-million-dollar endowments in the state. Martin Bell, a senior Foundation trustee, stepped forward, his face pale under the chandeliers. Charlotte, perhaps we should move this delicate discussion somewhere private, behind closed doors. Why? Charlotte asked, her voice dangerously calm. Because the donors are watching. The press is right over there. They were watching earlier, too, Charlotte replied coldly, when a child couldn't breathe, and no one here gave a damn. Martin swallowed hard, looking away. That's not what I meant. I know exactly what you meant. Preston's gaze shifted from the board members back to Charlotte, his smile entirely gone, replaced by a naked, desperate warning. This foundation cannot survive this kind of public scandal, Charlotte. We have the crucial Children's Clinic partnership waiting on tonight's endowment funds. We have hospital administrators in this room. You need to step up on that stage right now, reassure everyone, and stop letting this maintenance worker turn a minor technical glitch into a personal crusade. Graham looked down at Nora. The little girl's fingers were tightly twisted into the hem of his work shirt. Her eyes weren't frightened of an asthma attack anymore. They were wide with the heavy realization of adult corruption. Miss Vale, Graham murmured softly, looking up at Charlotte. He's right about one thing. Your foundation matters a lot more than me. Charlotte turned on him, her eyes flashing with sudden heat. Don't you dare say that. I'm not saying I don't matter, Graham said, gently placing the tape and the tag onto a clean white napkin on a nearby table. I'm just saying I know what rooms like this do when they need a scapegoat. Nora looked up at her father with trembling lips. Daddy, are they going to blame you? Graham dropped to one knee right there in front of her, blocking the harsh glare of the stage lights with his broad shoulders. They can try, Button, but you didn't do anything wrong. That doesn't always protect people, Nora whispered, echoing a bitter wisdom no 8-year-old should ever possess. Charlotte felt those words strike her core like a physical blow. Truth didn't always protect people. Money did. Titles did. Cameras did. And for too long, institutional silence had protected the guilty while crushing the innocent. Preston leaned in close to Charlotte, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Choose very carefully right now. You can have a clean, unbroken evening, a signed contract, and $3 million secure dollars. Or you can stand beside a maintenance worker you met 20 minutes ago, throw away your entire empire, and let every headline tomorrow ask why you lied about him being your husband. Graham rose slowly to his feet, picking up his tool bag. We should go, Nora. Charlotte stepped directly into their path, blocking the exit. No, before Graham could protest, Nora suddenly tugged at her backpack and pulled out the folded paper she had shown Charlotte earlier. I saw him, Nora said. Her voice was tiny, but it cut across the silent circle like the flame of a candle in a dark cathedral. Every head turned toward her. Graham looked down in shock. Button Nora pointed a small finger straight at the colored pencil lines on her drawing. When I was waiting near the kids' table, I drew the ceiling lights because they looked like stars, but before the screen went dark, I saw that man in the fancy suit go behind the heavy curtain. She wasn't speaking with anger. She was speaking with the absolute, unshakable innocence of a child who hadn't yet learned that powerful adults expect everyone else to be too terrified to tell the truth. Preston's face drained of every last trace of color. Graham gently lowered her hand, his voice thick with emotion. A child should never have to prove what adults are too cowardly to admit. Charlotte reached out and took the drawing with both hands. She looked at the tiny, awkward figure Nora had sketched near the west corridor, next to a timestamp written in purple-colored pencil because Nora liked marking moments. 8:16 p.m., 7 minutes before the screen went black. At that exact moment, the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone on the central stage, announcing that Miss Vale was ready to address the room. Preston exhaled sharply, thinking victory was finally his. Instead, Charlotte did not walk toward him. She turned her back on the board members, walked past Preston without a single glance, and stepped gracefully up onto the raised stage. There was no uplifting background music playing. There was no speechwriter standing in the wings with cue cards. There was no Preston whispering safe, sanitized corporate phrases into her ear. The ballroom lights overhead remained fully illuminated, but they no longer felt warm. They felt blindingly honest, exposing every tightened jaw, every scandalized expression, and every donor desperately wishing they were anywhere else in the world. Graham stood near the west corridor with Nora's small hand gripped tightly in his, halfway turned toward the exit doors. He knew that posture well, the quiet, dignified readiness of people who had spent a lifetime learning not to wait around for institutional grace. Charlotte stepped up to the podium and touched the metal grill of the microphone. A soft, clear crackle echoed through the expanse of speakers. Earlier tonight, Charlotte began, her voice steady, resonant, and completely unshakable. Someone in this ballroom asked me if Graham Whitaker was my husband. A sharp ripple of tension passed through the crowd. Graham closed his eyes for a brief second. Nora looked up at her father in confusion. Preston smiled a sharp, triumphant smile, convinced this was the public retraction and separation he had demanded. Charlotte looked straight past the cameras, locking her eyes directly onto Graham, then down at Nora, and finally back out at the sea of wealthy faces. "I didn't correct them," Charlotte said clearly, "because for the first time tonight, someone in this room was actually standing with me. The silence that followed wasn't polite. It wasn't confused. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a glass house shattering from the inside out." Preston's triumphant smile vanished so abruptly it looked like physical pain. Charlotte lifted Nora's drawing into the air, while simultaneously signaling the audio technician. A second later, the massive digital screen behind her projected a high-resolution live camera close-up of the paper. There it was, drawn in crooked lines of purple pencil, the heavy curtain, the service panel, and a tall man in a dark tuxedo standing where no guest was ever permitted to be. Beside the drawing, Charlotte placed the adhesive security access tag. At 8:16 p.m., drawn by an 8-year-old girl who was simply looking at the lights, a crime was committed against this foundation, Charlotte announced, her voice echoing powerfully off the marble walls. 7 minutes later, our donation display failed. We were then aggressively pressured to approve an emergency security contract from Calder Strategic Security. A wave of outraged murmurs broke out across the room. Preston surged forward toward the stage steps. "Charlotte, this is absolute madness. Reframe this immediately." She didn't even look down at him. "No, Preston. Madness is manufacturing a crisis and terrifying a room full of donors just so you can line your pockets with certainty. Recklessness is treating a children's charity like a criminal enterprise. And the ultimate cowardice is assuming that a man in work boots would be too invisible to notice what you hid behind a wall." Graham lowered his head slightly, not out of shame, but out of the profound, quiet discipline of a man who refused to turn another human being's public execution into his own personal celebration. Charlotte continued, her tone softening, turning almost fiercely tender. "Mr. Whitaker didn't ask for public attention. He didn't ask for a reward. He didn't ask me to defend him. He simply saw a child struggling for air, a system being corrupted by greed, and a truth that deserved to see the light of day." The trustees looked at Preston in horror. The donor slowly backed away from him as if he carried a contagious disease. The journalist at the front of the room tapped furiously on her keyboard, capturing not corporate gossip, but a historic downfall. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no defense could bridge the chasm of his exposed corruption. Charlotte turned toward the head of venue security in the front row. Please preserve the master maintenance panel, the contractor access logs, and all hallway security footage from 7:30 p.m. onward. Ensure no documents leave this building tonight, she turned back to the stunned ballroom. And as for Graham Whitaker, he is not a scandal. He is not a prop for your amusement. He is not a rumor for you to whisper about between dinner courses. Her gaze softened completely as she looked down at Nora. He is a father who kept his daughter safe when the rest of us completely forgot how to be human. For a long moment, no one applauded. They couldn't. The raw, unfiltered truth had entered the room so powerfully that it had stripped away every defense mechanism they owned. Graham squeezed Nora's small hand. "Daddy," Nora whispered, looking around at the stunned crowd. "Why is everyone so quiet?" Graham looked up at Charlotte, standing alone under the bright white lights, holding a child's crayon, drawing like a sacred scroll. "That's what happens," he answered softly, "when real respect finally walks into the room." The applause came late, and perhaps that was precisely why it was the most honest sound the Velare Foundation had ever heard. It didn't burst out like a manufactured celebration. It rose slowly, uncertainly at first, then steadied into a rolling wave as the wealthy elite realized they weren't applauding a political speech or a corporate strategy. They were clapping because a man they had judged, dismissed, and insulted had just saved a child, a foundation, and the truth without ever asking to be seen. Preston Calder was escorted out of the ballroom by 2 private security directors. There was no dramatic struggle, no shouting match, just the quiet, inevitable unraveling of a man whose lies had finally run out of polished language. An hour later, after official statements had been recorded, police reports filed, and the last of the shaken donors had drifted out into the chilly Denver night, the heavy double doors of the gala swung open. Graham and Nora reached the perimeter of the asphalt parking lot, only to find his ancient, battered pickup truck refusing to cooperate. The mountain air was sharp, carrying the crisp, freezing scent of an incoming snowstorm sweeping down from the Rockies. Graham turned the ignition key. The engine clicked once, groaned, and flatly died. He tried it again. Nothing, just a hollow, frustrating click. Nora pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, exhaling a puff of white vapor into the cold air. "Maybe the truck is tired too, Daddy." Graham rested his forehead against the cold steering wheel, letting out a heavy sigh that carried the exhaustion of 100 long weeks. "That makes 2 of us." Button, Ace-off polite knock tapped against the driver's side window. Graham looked up, blinking in surprise. Standing outside in the freezing wind was Charlotte. She was no longer surrounded by an entourage of anxious assistants, board members, or flashing cameras. Her expensive white evening dress was safely covered by a heavy, practical wool coat, and she had unclipped her high heels, carrying them comfortably in one hand as she stood on the pavement in stockinged feet. "May I wait with you?" Charlotte asked through the glass. Graham hesitated, slowly pushing the door open and stepping out into the cold. "People are still watching, Miss Vale. They'll talk." Charlotte looked past him into the passenger seat at Nora, then back at Graham, and finally out across the quiet, amber-lit parking lot. "Let them," she said softly, a genuine, radiant smile touching her lips. For once tonight, they were a lot closer to the truth than they ever deserved to be. Nora smiled brightly from inside the cab, unzipping her backpack once more. With immense care, she pulled out a brand-new sheet of paper one she hadn't shown anyone yet. She held it up against the truck window so the dome light illuminated it. It was another drawing, 3 distinct stick figures standing closely together under one broad, protective roof, every single window colored in a brilliant, welcoming shade of gold. Graham stared at the drawing for a long, silent moment. Charlotte looked at it beside him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. No grand promises were spoken in that freezing parking lot. No fairy tale romance rushed ahead of the slow, healing pacing of genuine grace. But something real, permanent, and fiercely honest had begun in the cold beside an old truck that refused to start. Because redemption doesn't always arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it simply looks like a woman choosing to protect kindness instead of an image, a father choosing deep dignity over bitter anger, and a little girl drawing a safe home before the adults around her are even brave enough to believe that one is possible.